It was just another quiet night in Ohio. The kind of night where everything seemed calm, like time itself had slowed down, wrapping the small town in a peaceful blanket of stillness. Ohio, a place tucked far away from the chaos of big cities, had always been known for its simplicity and tranquility. The streets were empty, save for a few cars driving by. The dim glow of streetlights cast long shadows across the old brick buildings and quiet homes that lined the town's main street. The air was cool, crisp, the kind of weather that made you want to pull your jacket tighter around you and walk slowly, savoring the peacefulness. People in town went about their usual routines. At the diner on the corner, a few old-timers sat hunched over their cups of coffee, chatting about the weather or the state of their crops. The local bar was quiet, only a few patrons sharing quiet laughs, and the occasional clink of glass. Finished her shift and walked home under the stars. It had been a strange few days. At first, it was just a few missing animals from the nearby farms. Reports started trickling in about cows disappearing overnight and chickens found scattered around, their feathers ruffled, as if something had attacked them. The farmers chalked it up to wild animals, maybe a pack of coyotes, or even a rogue bear. After all, Ohio was known for its wildlife. But it didn't take long for the pattern to become impossible to ignore. The animals weren't just disappearing. They were found mutilated. Their bodies were torn apart in ways that didn't make sense, with no clear signs of predators, no bite marks, no claw wounds, just destruction. At first, the townspeople dismissed the talk as just that. Talk. Small town gossip. The kind of thing that grew out of nothing and turned into something. They laughed it off in the diner, where the older folk shared exaggerated stories of the wild animals they had once encountered as young children. But Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. There was and then it started to happen. The disappearances. It wasn't just animals anymore. People began vanishing, one by one, in the middle of the night. At first, it was only a few, an elderly couple who had lived on the edge of town for decades, a young man who had just returned from a trip. No one thought much of it, at least not at first. People assumed they had left, gone somewhere else. It wasn't unusual for folks to head out to the city or take trips without telling anyone. The town was so small that it was easy to just slip away without anyone noticing.
But then it escalated. First, it was just 1 or 2 people. Then, entire families started disappearing. It was as if they had vanished into thin air. No signs of struggle. No blood. Nothing out of the ordinary to suggest any sort of violence had taken place. One morning, an entire family of 5 was gone. No signs of them leaving. No empty suitcases. No broken windows. The house was in perfect condition. Their car was still parked in the driveway. The police were called. But when they searched the area, they found nothing. No clues. No trails. It was as if they had just disappeared into the night. The town began to talk. Whispers spread from house to house, from one neighbor to another. At first, it was easy to dismiss. Just another one of those strange things that happened in small towns, right? A little too much drinking, a little too much gossip, and soon everyone was imagining monsters in their backyards. But then it happened again and again. Each time it was the same. The people were gone, leaving behind only the eerie silence of their homes. And the most unsettling part, there were no footprints, no signs of struggle, nothing to indicate how or why they were taken. Sarah began to feel a growing sense of dread, one that gnawed at her, even during the brightest hours of the day. She would walk down the street, and it felt like everyone was staring at her, as if they knew something she didn't. Her patients, the one she had known her entire life, looked at her with fear in their eyes. They weren't saying anything, but the worry was clear in their faces. It was the same look that Sarah had seen in the eyes of her friends and family when they spoke about the missing people. The fear of the unknown. The fear of something that couldn't be explained away. And then it happened to someone Sarah knew. Her neighbor, a young woman named Lisa, had gone out for a walk one evening and never returned. Sarah waited for her to come back, knowing that Lisa often wandered off for a while to clear her mind. But when morning came and there was still no sign of her, Sarah's anxiety grew into something more. She tried calling her phone, but it rang and rang without an answer. A feeling of unease settled deep in her stomach. She knew something was terribly wrong. By the time the town's police chief, Frank Daniels, started investigating the disappearances seriously, it was too late. The damage had already been done. The town was gripped by fear, and no one knew where the terror was coming from
or who would be next. It was as if the town itself had become a ghost town overnight. People keeping to their homes, afraid to venture out after dark. Rumors spread like wildfire, from whispers of a serial killer to more outlandish ideas. Some even spoke of an ancient curse, but none of them made any sense. Then, one night, Sarah decided to do what no one else dared to. She would visit Lisa's house, look around, and see if she could find any answers. Armed with a flashlight and a feeling of dread that she couldn't shake, she made her way through the empty streets to Lisa's house. She passed the darkened windows of other homes.
When she reached Lisa's home, she hesitated before pushing the door open. The wind was cold against her face, and the house seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for her. She stepped inside, the floor creaking beneath her feet. The house was empty, just as she expected. There were no signs of Lisa's struggle, no indication of where she had gone or why. But then, as she made her way through the house, she heard something. A faint scratching sound, like nails dragging across the floor. Her heart raced, her breath caught in her throat as she turned around. But there was nothing. Just the silence, thick and oppressive, like it was pressing in on her. It felt like something was watching her. She quickly made her way to the back door, but before she could open it, something caught her eye. A dark stain on the floor. It was fresh, and it was spreading. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind her. It was a crisp autumn evening when Lena decided to take her usual walk through the park with her dog, Charlie. She had just finished a long day at the school, teaching her 5th grade class about history, and the cool evening air felt refreshing against her skin. The park was peaceful at this time of day, with only the occasional jogger or elderly couple out for a stroll. The trees, which had begun to turn brilliant shades of orange and red, stood tall and proud, their branches swaying gently in the wind. The sound of Charlie's paws crunching against the dry leaves was the only noise that filled the otherwise quiet park. Lena enjoyed these walks. They gave her a chance to unwind, to clear her head after a busy day. She let Charlie wander ahead of her, his leash slack as he sniffed around, chasing after squirrels and the occasional rabbit. Lena smiled, watching the dog with affection. He was a good companion, loyal and energetic, always eager to. But as she turned the corner near the far end of the park, she noticed something strange. The air seemed to grow colder, and a sense of unease washed over her. She stopped for a moment, feeling the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. There was no logical reason for her to feel this way, but something
wasn't right. Charlie, who usually trotted along happily, suddenly stopped and raised his head. His ears pricked. His body was tense, and his tail hung low. Lena looked ahead, trying to make sense of the uneasy feeling in her chest. Then she heard it, a distant growl. It was low and guttural, like the sound of something hungry, something feral. It came from the darkness at the far edge of the park, where the trees were thick and the shadows deep. For a moment, Lena thought it might be an animal, a stray dog maybe, or a raccoon. But as the growl grew louder, her heart began to race as she slowly took a step forward, hoping to see what was making the noise. Charlie barked sharply, his growls joining the eerie sounds in the distance. Lena's hand tightened around the leash, pulling him closer to her. The growls weren't stopping. They were growing louder, closer, and more frantic. She felt a chill run through her, her breath catching in her throat as she began to walk toward the sound, instinctively trying to understand what was happening. As she rounded the corner of the park, her eyes fell upon a group of figures standing in the middle of the path. At first, they appeared to be people, maybe a group of homeless individuals or teenagers causing trouble. But as Lena looked closer, her blood ran cold. These weren't people. Their skin was pale, sickly, and stretched tightly over their bones, giving them a ghastly, unnatural look. Their eyes were bloodshot, almost glowing in the dim light of the setting sun, and they staggered forward with a disturbing, jerky motion. They didn't walk normally, but moved in a way that seemed unsure, as if their bodies were no longer their own. It was as though they were struggling to control their movements, each step appearing painful and awkward. Lena froze, her breath caught in her chest. Her mind raced, trying to process what she was seeing. The figures shuffled closer, moving with a disturbing hunger in their eyes. There was a smell that accompanied them, a rancid, decaying stench that made Lena gag. She felt a wave of nausea hit her, but her legs wouldn't move. Her entire body was frozen, her eyes locked on the strange creatures ahead of her. One of them turned its head toward her, its movements slow and deliberate. Lena's heart pounded in her chest as the creature's eyes locked onto hers. There was no mistaking the hunger in its gaze, a primal, insatiable hunger. It was a look she had seen before in animals, but never in humans, and the realization sent a jolt of terror through her. Before she could react, the creature took a slow step toward her, its movements unnervingly smooth, despite its disjointed appearance. It stretched out one long, rotting arm toward her, the fingers twitching as if it couldn't quite control them. In that instant, Lena snapped out of her frozen state. "Charlie!" she screamed, pulling the leash as hard as she could. Her dog, who had been barking madly, lunged forward, tugging her away from the approaching creature. She stumbled back,
her heart racing as the dog dragged her behind him. The sound of her own frantic footsteps, mixed with Charlie's barking, filled the night air as they ran, desperately putting distance between themselves and the things behind her. Lena didn't stop to look back, her focus entirely on escaping the terror that was following her. She could hear the growls growing louder, the sound of the creature's labored, uneven footsteps getting closer. They were pursuing her, and there was no way she could outrun them. The park was too quiet, the paths too open. She couldn't hide. She had nowhere to go. Her mind raced, her thoughts a jumbled mess of fear and confusion. What were they? Why were they chasing her? She could barely process the horror of it all, the images of the creature's rotting flesh, their bloodshot eyes, their ravenous movements. With a final burst of energy, Lena and Charlie reached the edge of the park, where the street lights flickered faintly in the distance. She didn't dare stop to catch her breath. They had made it out of the park, but the fear was still there, gnawing at her. She ran the entire way home, her legs burning, Charlie still barking beside her. When she reached her house, she slammed the door shut behind her, her heart hammering in her chest. She leaned against the door, gasping for air, her body shaking uncontrollably. She tried to calm herself, but the images of the creatures kept flashing in her mind. They weren't human. They couldn't be. And the worst part, she knew they were still out there. That night, Lena barely slept. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind outside had her heart racing. She kept thinking about what she had seen, about the way the creatures moved, how they looked at her. But when she tried to tell anyone, when she tried to warn the others, no one believed her. They all thought it was just her imagination running wild. Or maybe the stress of her job had finally caught up to her. Even Charlie seemed to calm down, though Lena could tell he too was unsettled by the night's events. But Lena knew the truth. What she had seen was real, and they were out there, waiting. By the time the sun rose the next morning, Ohio's small town was no longer the quiet, peaceful place it once was. The calm that had settled over the streets only hours before had vanished, replaced by an unsettling, palpable tension. As Lena stepped out of her house and onto the porch, she could already feel that something was terribly wrong. There was no bird song, no gentle hum of life. The world felt unnaturally still, almost as if it was holding its breath. The silence weighed heavily on her chest, and every step she took was filled with the gnawing sense of dread that had crept in the night before. The first signs of chaos began at the police station. It started with frantic calls pouring in from all over the town.
People were screaming, telling stories of attacks, of people going missing, of strange figures lurking in the shadows. The police officers, already overwhelmed by the confusion, could barely keep up. Calls came from every direction. Farms, homes, even the schools. And then, just as quickly as the calls had started, they stopped. The phones went dead. The communication lines were cut, leaving the town completely isolated from the outside world. No one knew what was happening or why.
Jason, Lena's childhood friend, had been at the local hospital when the first attack occurred. He had been doing his rounds in the emergency room when a man, disheveled and bloodied, was brought in by a group of frightened civilians. His face was barely recognizable. His skin gnawed away in patches, revealing raw muscle and bone. His limbs were bent at odd angles, as though they had been twisted or broken. But the most horrifying thing of all was that the man was still alive. His eyes were glazed, unfocused, but there was a strange, guttural sound coming from his throat. The hospital staff rushed to treat him, though Jason could see the confusion and fear in their eyes. The man was severely injured, his body on the verge of collapse, but his pulse still beat faintly. It didn't make sense. Jason had seen horrific injuries before, but nothing like this. He tried to remain calm, to focus on the task at hand. But deep down, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was horribly off. His mind kept replaying Lena's words from the night before. The strange creatures she had encountered in the park. As the medical team worked to stabilize the man, they found themselves struggling to assess his condition. His wounds were deep and strange. They weren't animal bites. They were something else entirely. The tissue around the wounds was blackened, necrotic. The man's breathing was shallow and labored, and Jason noticed that the longer they tried to help him, the more frantic his movements became. It was as though the man wasn't even aware of them. Or maybe he was aware. But something else, something primal, was driving him. And then it happened. Jason and the other medical staff were caught off guard when the man suddenly lurched forward, his body convulsing violently. His eyes snapped open wide, revealing bloodshot, soulless pupils. And with a horrifying scream, he lunged for the nearest nurse, his teeth snapping like a rabid animal. The nurse screamed as the man's mouth clamped onto her arm, and the rest of the room. Jason froze for a split second, unsure of what was happening. But the panic in the room quickly snapped him out of his daze. The staff rushed to help, trying to pull the man off the nurse. But it was too late. He was stronger than anyone could have imagined. With an unnatural force, he broke free from their grasp, his teeth sinking deeper into the nurse's flesh. Her screams echoed through the hallway as Jason grabbed a nearby chair and swung it at the man's head, knocking him to the floor. But it wasn't over. The man didn't stop. He scrambled to his feet, his eyes wild, his mouth covered in blood. He turned toward Jason, and for a moment, there was a terrible stillness. The man's head jerked to the side, like a predator sizing up its prey. Jason felt a chill run down his spine as the man's mouth curled into a... It all happened so fast. The man lunged at Jason, his teeth snapping at his throat. Jason barely managed to dodge, but the attack sent him sprawling to the floor. His heart pounded in his chest as he scrambled to his feet, his mind racing. This wasn't just some freak accident. This wasn't just a rabid animal attack. This was something much worse. Jason barely had time to process the horror before the man, now a twisted, uncontrollable force, attacked again. This time, the other members of the medical team weren't quick enough to react. They tried to hold him down, but it was as if the man wasn't even human anymore. His strength was inhuman, his movements erratic and terrifyingly fast. With every attack, he seemed to grow more violent, more desperate to sink his teeth into anyone within reach. In a panic, Jason turned and bolted for the door, his heart racing in his chest. He heard the screams behind him, the chaos unfolding as the man, now fully transformed into something monstrous, attacked anyone he could. Jason could feel the hot breath of the undead creature on his neck as he sprinted down the hall, his mind screaming for him to survive. He stumbled, falling against the wall, but managed to pull himself back up. His body burned from the exertion. But there was no time to stop. He couldn't stop. The exit was only a few feet away, and just as Jason thought he was safe, he heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Not the slow, methodical steps of a human, but something faster, more erratic, more dangerous. He turned around, his blood running cold when he saw what was chasing him. More figures, more of those things. Jason made it to the exit just as one of the creatures lunged at him. He pushed through the door, slamming it behind him with all the strength he had left. He was outside now, gasping for air, his mind struggling to comprehend what had just happened. The world outside had become a nightmare. He ran into the streets, his mind still reeling from the events inside the hospital. His eyes darted around the town, seeing the chaos unfolding in every direction. People were screaming, running, trying to escape. It was clear now. The undead had arrived, and the town was under siege. As Jason stood there, his chest heaving with panic, he realized that what had started as a simple attack in the hospital was just the beginning. The town of Ohio was no longer a peaceful place. The undead were among them, and no one was safe. The horror had begun. Lena's hands were trembling as she pounded the last nail into the wooden board, securing the door to the old high school's main entrance. The sound of the hammer hitting the wood echoed through the hollow hallways, a reminder that every single noise could be the difference between life and death. As she stepped back and wiped the sweat from her brow, she surveyed the makeshift barricade that was quickly becoming their only line of defense. The survivors, a small group of terrified people who had once been strangers, now depended on each other for their very survival. The school, an aging building that had stood for decades, was now their last refuge. It had been the only place they could think of that might offer a little protection. The thick brick walls, the large windows high above the ground, and the locked gates made it a stronghold of sorts. But none of them were naive enough to think it would be enough. Lena took a deep breath and stepped back to join the others in the dimly lit gymnasium. Jason, her old friend from childhood, was sitting in the corner, sharpening a makeshift spear he'd crafted out of a broken broomstick and a rusty kitchen knife. His eyes were bloodshot, his face pale and drawn from lack of sleep. He had always been the level-headed one, the person everyone turned to when things went wrong, but even he seemed on edge now. Around them, the other survivors were busy fortifying the building. Some were boarding up windows with pieces of old furniture and metal scraps, while others were digging through the school's storage closets for anything they could use to defend themselves. It was a constant scramble, a race against time, because they all knew that the longer they stayed in one place, the more likely it was the undead would find them. Lena's thoughts wandered back to the night they had arrived at the school. The sounds of the world outside had been full of chaos. The groans of the undead, the screams of people being attacked, the terrifying, sickening growls that sent chills up her spine. But it wasn't just the zombies that haunted her. It was the fear, the overwhelming sense of helplessness that had taken hold of everyone. They were trapped in this building, and the outside world was no longer safe. It was a nightmare they couldn't wake up from. The group had been working for hours, and their progress was slow. The survivors took shifts, keeping watch, while the others rested or tried to catch up on much-needed sleep. But sleep didn't come easily anymore. Every creak of the floorboards, every rattle of a door, or the faintest scratch against the window sent their hearts racing. It felt as though the walls were closing in on them, as if they were living in a constant state of hypervigilance. Even the simplest tasks felt impossible in this new world, where survival meant being prepared for anything and expecting the worst. Lena, Jason's voice broke through her thoughts. He was standing, his eyes narrowed with concern. We need to talk. Lena nodded, her mind already running through a list of possible strategies, plans. We're running out of supplies, Jason said, his voice rough. We've got enough food to last us a few more days, maybe a week at most. But after that, we're going to have to start making some hard choices. Lena glanced around at the small group of survivors. There were 10 of them now, some people they had met along the way, others who had come from town. A mix of ages, backgrounds, and professions. They didn't all know each other, but they had all been thrown together in the face of the same horror. She couldn't help but feel the weight of responsibility on her shoulders. As their de facto leader, she had to make the tough decisions, and that meant keeping them alive at all costs. I know, Lena replied quietly, but Will can't leave. Not yet. Not until we have a plan. We can't afford to get careless. If we try to move now, we risk getting picked off one by one. We stay here and fight. We make sure we're prepared for whatever comes next. Jason didn't argue. He knew as well as she did that the school was their best option right now. But even as they fortified their defenses, there was a sinking feeling in Lena's stomach that they weren't safe. Every day felt like a ticking clock, counting down to when the undead would eventually find their way in. Later that evening, the group gathered in the gymnasium. The only light came from the faint glow of candles and flashlights, casting long shadows across the walls. The survivors sat in a circle, some hunched over, others leaning against the walls. The fatigue was written on everyone's face, but there was something else in their eyes now too. Fear. They could all feel it. The horror was closing in. We've got a plan, Lena began, standing up in front of the group. We can't keep waiting around for things to get worse. We need to make sure we have food, water, and weapons. We'll send out a small group tomorrow to look for supplies. We'll check the grocery store, maybe the pharmacy, but we'll need to be quick. We can't take too many risks. If we encounter any of them... Lena's voice trailed off as she thought about the zombies. They didn't need a reason to attack. They were driven by hunger, by a need to tear flesh from bone. They had no reason, no rhyme or logic. They were primal, their actions instinctual and relentless. They didn't care who you were or how you had lived your life. If you were human, you were prey. "We're going to have to be careful," Jason interjected. "If we run into one of those things, we don't hesitate. We don't take chances."
Lena nodded. She could feel the tension in the room, the unease that was slowly growing. Everyone knew what had happened to the town. They knew the undead were out there, hunting, waiting for the moment to strike. But what they didn't know was how long they could hold out. The thought of running out of supplies, of losing their shelter, of being forced into the open, it terrified them. As the night wore on, the group fell into uneasy silence. They had their plans, but no one was under any illusion about what lay ahead. Survival was no longer just about fighting the zombies. It was about surviving each other. Trust was wearing thin, and the constant fear was beginning to crack the fragile bonds that had held them together. It wasn't just the zombies they had to worry about now. It was the strain of the situation, the pressure of living in constant fear.
Lena lay awake that night, listening to the sounds of her companions shifting restlessly in their sleep. She couldn't bring herself to close her eyes. Every shadow, every creak of the building made her tense. She couldn't shake the feeling that the undead were already close, watching, waiting for the moment when they would strike. She had to keep the group together, keep them focused. But as the night dragged on, the fear that had been so distant before began to creep into her thoughts. The longer they stayed in the school, the more likely they were to be discovered. And when that happened, they wouldn't stand a chance. As the first light of dawn broke through the cracks in the boarded-up windows, Lena knew they were running out of time. The fight for survival had just begun. The days dragged on in their bleak, makeshift sanctuary. The old high school that had once been a place of education, now transformed into a fortress for a small group of survivors. As the world outside continued its descent into chaos, Lena and the others did their best to hold on, fighting not just the undead, but also the creeping fear that gnawed at their insides. The supplies they had scavenged in the beginning were running low. The canned food, the bottled water, the first aid kits, all were being depleted faster than they could replenish them. There was no telling how much longer they could survive. Tensions within the group were rising. It was inevitable. People had always been quick to blame others in times of crisis, and now that everyone was living in constant fear, old habits and mistrust resurfaced. Jason, who had been the calm and reliable one, the person everyone turned to for guidance, was starting to crack under the pressure. He had always been the steady presence in the chaos, but now his eyes were bloodshot. his voice sharp and his movements erratic. He was no longer the man Lena had known all her life. Lena had watched it happen slowly at first, his paranoia creeping in like a shadow at the edge of his mind. It started with little things, whispers when he thought no one was listening, his hand twitching as he checked the barricades for the 100th time, his eyes darting suspiciously from face to face. But soon it became impossible to ignore. He began swearing that someone in the group had been bitten and was hiding it from the rest of them. He would accuse people randomly, his voice trembling with suspicion. "We can't trust anyone anymore," he muttered one night, his eyes wild as he paced back and forth. "Anyone could be one of them. We're all just waiting to turn on each other." At first, the others tried to calm him down, convincing him that they were all in this together, that no one was hiding anything. But Jason's mind had already begun to spiral. The fear of betrayal, more terrifying to him than the zombies that lurked outside. He would stare at each survivor as if trying to gauge their every move, looking for signs of infection, signs of weakness. He stopped sleeping, keeping watch over the group all night, his face drawn and haunted. Lena watched him with growing concern. She knew that the real enemy wasn't just the undead. It was the fear that was starting to take root in their hearts. It was easy to feel like there was no one left to trust when the world had turned upside down. But Jason's paranoia was becoming dangerous. Then, one night, when it seemed like they might just make it through, the worst happened. The night had fallen thick and oppressive, the air still and heavy with the weight of the unknown. The survivors sat in a circle, eating the last of their rations and quietly discussing their next move. There was a sense of resignation in the air, an understanding that they could only hold on for so long before they'd have to make a choice, leave the school and try to find a safer place, or stay and fight the zombies, hoping to outlast them. The fire they had set up in the corner of the gymnasium crackled softly, casting long shadows across the room. The tension had somewhat lifted in the past few hours as the group worked together, sharing stories and even laughing a little. It felt like they were making it through the worst of it. The physical exhaustion, the emotional toll, the constant fear of being overrun. But then, in the darkness, the first scream came. It was shrill and panicked, the kind of scream that cuts through the stillness of the night and lodges itself deep in your chest. Lena bolted upright, her heart pounding in her throat. The scream came from the direction of the dormitories, where some of the survivors were resting. Without thinking, she jumped to her feet, grabbing the closest weapon she could find, a metal pipe, and rushed toward the source of the noise. Jason was right behind her, his face twisted in a mixture of anger and fear. They reached the dormitory in a matter of seconds, and when they pushed open the door, what they saw froze them both in place. Bill, one of the survivors, was on the floor, his face twisted in agony, his eyes bloodshot and wild. His clothes were torn, and his body was covered in blood. But it wasn't his own blood. He had bitten 2 people, Lucy and Tom, both of whom were lying motionless on the floor, their bodies limp and lifeless. Bill's face was no longer human. His skin had taken on the same sickly pale color as the undead, his eyes glowing with an inhuman hunger. He had already turned. Lena and Jason didn't hesitate. They lunged forward, trying to restrain him, to stop him before he could do any more damage. But it was too late. The infection had already taken hold of him, and he was too strong, too relentless. Bill snarled as he swung at them, his strength far beyond that of a normal man. In the chaos, Lena barely managed to grab a piece of wood and jab it into Bill's chest, knocking him backward. But the damage had already been done. Lucy and Tom were both gone. As the rest of the survivors rushed into the room, the reality of what had just happened set in. The quiet, calm facade they had been trying to hold together shattered in an instant. Bill had hidden his bite from the group, hoping to survive long enough to turn without anyone noticing. But the infection had taken hold faster than he could hide it. Now, the group was down 2 more people, and Bill was a danger to them all. They couldn't just leave him to turn and possibly kill more of them. Lena's hand shook as she turned to Jason. His face was pale, his eyes wide with shock. But there was no time for hesitation. They had to act, and they had to act fast. The others quickly moved in to restrain Bill, and with a single horrible strike, they ended it. But as Lena and Jason stepped back, breathing heavily, the weight of what had just happened crashed down on them. It wasn't just the undead they had to fear anymore. The trust that had held them together for so long was broken. Bill had been hiding his infection, and now they were left to wonder if any of the others were doing the same. The thought that anyone in the group could turn on them like this was more terrifying than any zombie could ever be. The line between survivor and monster was no longer clear. Lena barely had time to grieve the loss of Lucy and Tom before the real consequences hit. Jason looked at her with wide eyes, a mixture of fear and regret in his expression. "I told you," he whispered. "I knew one of us was hiding it. I knew someone was going to betray us." Lena didn't respond. She couldn't. What Jason said
was true. But the question now was, who else could they trust? Would they survive each other? Or would the fear of betrayal be their undoing? In the end, survival wasn't just about fighting the zombies. It was about...
The days had become a blur of chaos and fear. Weeks of fighting, of barricading themselves in the old high school, had whittled their group down to just 4 survivors. The others, the ones they had once laughed with, shared stories with, trusted, were all gone. Some had fallen victim to the zombies, others to their own desperation and fear. It had been a brutal, relentless journey. The constant threat of death hung over them like a dark cloud, and hope, once a strong and vibrant force, was now nothing more than a fragile thread, pulling them forward only by sheer willpower. Lena looked around at the faces of the 3 remaining survivors. Jason, who had once been the calm and composed leader, now a shadow of his former self. Sarah, the young woman who had lost everything, her eyes empty but determined. And Mark, the quiet one who had remained stoic through it all, but whose eyes told the story of a man worn down by loss and exhaustion. They were all bruised, battered, and covered in the grime of weeks without proper care. Their clothes were torn, their bodies aching, and their spirits were on the verge of breaking. But there was still a spark in them, a drive to push forward. It was either that or give in to the overwhelming despair of this new world. The radio had been their only source of hope for the past few days. Faint transmissions crackled through the static, telling them of a nearby military camp, a place where survivors had gathered, a place that might be safe. Lena had held on to that hope, clinging to the idea that there was still a chance to survive, a place where they could rebuild. The message was vague, and the transmission had cut off suddenly, but it was enough. It was all they had. And so, with the last of their strength, the group made the decision. They would leave the high school, venture into the unknown, and try to reach the military camp. There was no other option. They had no food left, no water, and no hope of survival if they stayed. It was now. The journey was treacherous from the start. The roads were littered with abandoned vehicles, many of which had been overturned or set on fire. The air smelled of smoke, rot, and decay. The streets were eerily silent, save for the occasional distant groan of the undead. Every corner they turned, every shadow they passed, felt like a trap waiting to close in on them. They had learned to stay quiet, to move swiftly, to keep their heads down, and avoid attracting attention. But no matter how careful they were, the zombies were everywhere. They were relentless, their numbers growing with each passing day. At first, the survivors managed to avoid most of the zombies, slipping past them in the dead of night or hiding in alleys during the day. But as they neared the outskirts of the town, the encounters became more frequent. The zombies were growing more aggressive, their movements faster, their hunger fiercer. It was as if they were aware of the survivors' presence, as if they were hunting them with a single-minded determination. Jason was the first to be injured. They had taken refuge in an abandoned store, hoping to catch their breath, when a horde of zombies appeared out of nowhere. They had been so focused on staying quiet that they hadn't heard the growls, hadn't seen the figures moving in the shadows. It was a blur of frantic movement, of terrified screams and desperate actions. Jason had taken a hit, a deep gash across his arm, but he had fought through it, pushing them all forward. They had to keep moving. By the time they reached the outskirts of the town, the group was barely holding on. Their bodies ached, their muscles screamed for rest, but they couldn't afford to stop. The undead were closing in, and the fear of being caught, of being trapped again, pushed them forward with a force they couldn't ignore. Every step felt like it might be their last, but still they kept moving. As they trudged along the barren road, the sky above them darkened, heavy clouds swirling overhead. The winds had picked up, howling through the trees and carrying the scent of death with them. They had lost their sense of time, their days and nights blending into one long, exhausting stretch of survival. The promise of the military camp kept them going, but the doubt was creeping in. What if they didn't find it? What if it was just another illusion, another dead end? But as they rounded a bend in the road, they saw it. The camp. It was distant at first. A silhouette against the dark horizon. But as they drew closer, their hearts lifted in tentative hope. The barbed wire fences, the watchtowers. It all looked so promising. The gates were open, the camp seemingly abandoned, but intact. Lena's heart raced as they approached. But as they drew closer, the reality of the situation hit her. There were no guards, no soldiers, no survivors. The camp had been overrun. The gates, once a symbol of safety, now the truth hit them like a wave crashing against rocks. The camp had fallen. Weeks ago, maybe months, The undead had taken over, and the soldiers, the survivors, were gone. There was no safe haven left, no place to run. The world they had known had ended, and they were no longer just fighting for survival. They were fighting for their lives, with no one and nothing left to turn to. Lena felt her knees weaken, the weight of the realization pulling her down. She had clung to the idea of safety, of hope, but now it was all gone. There was nothing left. The camp was a graveyard, a reminder that the undead had taken everything, and the world they had known was nothing but a distant memory. But even as the harsh truth settled in, something within Lena refused to give up. The last of the survivors stood together, facing the reality of their situation. But they did not surrender. They had come this far. They had fought for too long to give in now. The undead were closing in, but they wouldn't die without a fight. They made a vow to survive, no matter what, even if it meant standing against the darkness, standing against the monsters that roamed the world. They would keep fighting. There was no safe place left. There was no tomorrow waiting for them. But as long as they were still breathing, they would continue to fight. They gathered their weapons, their resolve hardening with each passing moment. The zombies were coming, and there was no running anymore. It was time to make their final stand. They had nothing left to lose, but they would fight with everything they had, because in a world like this, survival wasn't a choice. It was the only thing left to do. And so, with the undead closing in on them from all sides, they stood together, ready to face the last battle of their lives.